John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 43. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. John has cancer. And not just any kind of cancer. He's got terminal lung cancer. And after moping around for a bit, he decided that he needs to fight this. And he's the Magus, so of course he's going to use magic to try to beat this thing. So in the last issue, we saw him go to his old friend who's named Brendan, who's also a sorcerer, to see if Brendan could help him get rid of his cancer. It turns out Brendan was excited for John to come over because he also has cancer, just liver cancer. And so he thought, oh, John will help me figure this out. And also, Brendan had sold his soul to the devil in order to be able to afford and collect the finest drinks in the land. And because of this, as Brendan passed that night, the devil came to collect, and John actually got to best the devil by tricking him into drinking a magical stout that was actually holy water. And we left that issue with John being excited that he just outsmarted the devil. But then he realizes, oh shit, if I die, that devil who's now in hell is going to be very pissed. So I better not die. And I just used one of my options of fixing this. So hopefully I can find something else. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 43, we got the cover here. This is actually a pretty mild cover compared to most of the other Hellblazer covers we see. This one is just a night scene in a park. There's like a horse and carriage going by and a man sitting on a bench. But there is, just like the other covers with this run so far, a cut-in of John Constantine's face looking very freaked out. It's got some great underlighting, which makes it kind of look spooky, almost like he's holding a flashlight under his head. And on the first page, we see John Constantine, and we just see his face on this page, and he looks like he's straining extremely hard. His teeth are gritted, there's sweat pouring down his face. There's even some blood on his shoulders, which also have these weird looking sores. And we see there's some narration that is talking about a boy named Matthew that Mercury met during the Fear Machine arc. And John's thinking about him because this boy was afraid of cancer. And he didn't quite know what it looked like or anything. He was just scared of the idea of cancer. And so John is thinking about him because this ends up being a dream. We see on the next page a grotesque, cancer-ridden version of John. Even his trench coat has cancer growing on it and through it, and he is just one big mass of growths. And we see the name of this issue is Friends in High Places, which is part 3 of Dangerous Habits, and the writer is Garth Ennis with art by Will Simpson and Malcolm Jones III. So John Constantine wakes up in a fright from this horrible image of himself with all these growths, and it turns out he dozed off on a park bench that is overlooking the ocean. And he dozed off because he hasn't been feeling too good. He says that it's been over a month since he found out about his cancer, and now it's starting in good and proper. He's getting headaches and nausea, he's spitting up blood, and he's tired all the time. And as he sits on the bench, he thinks, took me 2 hours to find the person I'm here to meet. She's an hour late, for God's sake. And just as he finishes that thought, someone speaks next to John and scares the hell out of him, and they say, 50 minutes, actually. And the person who was talking comes to sit down by John. Turns out this is a woman named Ellie, and John has called her here because he thinks she might be able to help. And they have a very back and forth or tit for tat way of speaking to each other. As she sits down, John offers her a cigarette, and she says,
You know I don't, and I hardly need to add that you shouldn't either. Look where it's got you. And John kind of leans back in the bench and says, I noticed, thanks. And their relationship is interesting because it seems like they're just so witty with each other. But then John pulls out a thing of coffee and some sandwiches, and they proceed to have a little lunch together. And while they're eating and drinking, they just kind of ask each other the mundane questions like, oh, how are things going? And as the reader, you think, oh, they're just old friends catching up. And when he asks, oh, how are things? She says, not bad, I suppose. The boss has been a bit ratty recently, but otherwise, just the usual. And then John kind of gives a coy smile and asks, yeah, I was going to ask about him. How ratty is ratty? She answers, John, don't be so flippant. This isn't something you just brush off, you know. What were you thinking of? You poison him with holy water and smash him in the face with a broken bottle? You idiot. And John tries to interject to defend himself, but she keeps going. He knows you're dying, John. He's just sitting down there and waiting. And when you show up, he's going to rip your soul to pieces. Very slowly. I mean, he usually doesn't get his hands on the ones he really hates, does he? And John, who's still trying to defend himself a little bit, says, Ellie, Brendan was my mate, for God's sake. But Ellie cuts him off, saying, I hope that'll be some comfort to you when the pain begins. You've gotten him so angry it's frightening. All that fury that's built up over the aeons, with all those saints and martyrs and bloody good people slipping through his grasp, he's going to take that all out on you. And even though John knew this, hearing it confirmed from someone who would know snaps John into reality a bit, and he says, I sort of knew all that, but you always hope, you know? Oh, shit. Oh, Christ. I don't suppose maybe you could tell him? But Ellie cuts him off before he can finish his request, saying, oh, spare me. What am I supposed to do? Shit, John. I know I owe you one and everything, but to ask that, your mind's going. And upon hearing that, John gets a little bit salty. He kind of gives her the cold shoulder for a second and says, that's that then. I'm screwed. And then he stands up and he's all sulky and he says, I'll see you, Ellie. Thanks. And he begins to walk away. And I'm not sure if this is like an act. I don't think it is, but it could be an act because Ellie seeing him walk away makes her give a second thought, and she says, shit. And then she gets up and goes towards him and says, hey, John, hold up. Sorry. And then she begins to walk with him on the beach. And as they talk, she says, as I see it, you've got two things to try. You can either try repenting your sins so you don't go to hell and he can't get his hands on you. And John cuts her off saying, my sins? I doubt it, Ellie. The good Lord would probably just sneak down from on high saying, pull the other one, John, my boy. And Ellie says, good point. Well, the other thing is you could try and get the cancer cured. It wouldn't be much good in the long run, but you'd have a few more years before he got you. And John dismisses that suggestion. He says, nah, it's terminal, Ellie. No way out. And then Ellie has an idea and she says, are you sure? Maybe the elemental could help. Clean out your system or something and regrow all the messed up tissue? And John says, I doubt it. We're not on the best of terms these days, to tell you the truth. He's busy anyway. Too busy to help me. The big green git can be one ungrateful bastard sometimes. You'd never guess if it wasn't for me, he'd be someone's compost heap, would you? And if you didn't know, the elemental that they're talking about is Swamp Thing. And John actually calls Swamp Thing a wanker, which is interesting because if you know anything about Swamp Thing, John is the one who is always the dick to Swamp Thing. It's usually not the other way around. So with John getting all bitter about Swamp Thing, Ellie says, oh, John, if you really expected thanks for all the stuff you do, you'd never have gotten anywhere. You're not thinking straight. You're just bitter. Can't say I blame you. And then she stops for a second as John continues to walk in front of her, and she thinks, and she looks at John and she goes, John, there's always the snob. And at this suggestion, John gets very angry and he says, the snob? Oh, Christ, Ellie, not the bloody snob. I mean, I've met some wankers in my life, but that one is king. And Ellie says, I know, John. The thing is, he's just about your only chance left. He's pretty well connected, remember? And John is angry. He thinks about it for a second, and he grits his teeth, and he says, the snob it is. Shit. So now that they've decided that John is going to see someone named the Snob, they walk to the train station, and John tells Ellie thanks for the help. And Ellie says, don't worry. Take care of yourself, will you? And John kind of stops and looks at her and smiles and says, you're okay, Ellie. You know that? I mean, considering what it is you actually are, you're pretty decent. And Ellie looks at John with a shy smile and says, I don't think so, John. And then her face changes all evil for a second. She gets this big grin on her face, and you see all these angles come out, and her teeth look a little bit pointed as she smiles. She still looks human, just like an evil version of herself. And she says, I think I'm just polite. And then she snaps back into her regular human-looking self, and they say their goodbyes to each other. She says that she'll see him later, and he says, later rather than sooner with a bit of luck. Because if you haven't guessed yet, Ellie is a demon, obviously. Her boss is the devil. And I think this is the first time we're ever seeing John work with a demon, like they're friends or something. So that's kind of interesting. So as John's leaving, Ellie turns to him and says, give my love to the snob, will you? And then we cut to the cancer ward. And this is the same one that John visited in the first issue, where he met the old man named Matt who was dying. And it turns out that John has been visiting Matt regularly. I don't know if it's daily or weekly, but definitely John's been visiting him. He brings him some contraband. I don't know if it's dirty magazines or cigarettes, but it's definitely stuff this old man is not supposed to have in the cancer ward. And one thing that's interesting is in the narration, John is calling Matt his friend, which is very touching, but also gives me a bad feeling about Matt because all of John's friends tend to die. But I guess Matt is in the cancer ward, so, that's going to happen anyway. And when Matt sees John, he says, all right, Blondie, how goes it? And John sits down by him and he looks him in the face and he says, not great, Matt. And Matt looks at him seriously and he says, I still don't understand you, mate. There you are with cancer, right? But you haven't booked in here. So what are you up to? And John looks at him and says, I don't know, sort of clutching at straws, really. If someone told you you were going to die, okay? And Matt interjects, someone has. And John continues, yeah, but if you were a bit more determined to live, wouldn't you try everything, no matter how daft or weird or whatever? And Matt says, a bit more determined? An old heap of worm bait with nothing to live for, you mean? Course I'd bloody try everything, son. Who wouldn't? So what are you going to do? And John looks at him with a smile and says, got a couple ideas. And Matt says, ooh, hark at Mr. Mysterious. Okay, none of my business, mate. And then John pulls out a flask and offers Matt a drink. And he takes one too. And he says to Matt, what'd you do, Matt? When they told you, I mean. And Matt says, about the cancer? There's a tale. About 2 years ago, I get these pains in my chest. And the quack says heart disease, lung cancer in early stages, cirrhosis of the liver for good measure. Stop the booze and the fags at once, and no excitement. So I, quick as a flash and witty as you like, says, bollocks, and I carry right on with all of it. See, I reckoned I was dying anyway, so if I was just to keep at it, I'd cough it some night in a pub, nice and quick, instead of taking months over it in some bloody cancer ward. So sure enough, I'm down at the Red Rover a while back, and everything packs up on me all at once. Feels like I've been stabbed in the chest and I shit myself. But do I wake at the pearly gates? Do I, buggery? So much for planning ahead. And John gets a kick out of this story, and he says, Christ, Matt, you should be on stage. Come to think of it, I had to introduce you to the snob just to piss him off. And Matt asks John who the snob is, and John answers, a complete arsehole is who he is. This stuck-up tosser who looks down on everyone. I mean everyone. And then he expects them to kiss his arsehole the same. Total bastard. And while John's talking, he's lighting cigarettes for both of them, and they both begin to smoke in the cancer ward. And Matt takes a long draw on a cigarette, and he says that he thinks this man sounds a lot like a lieutenant that he knew in the military. And basically, this lieutenant thought he was freaking awesome, he was God's gift to the earth, and everybody else sucked, including his men. So one day, while they were all fighting in World War II, this lieutenant that was in charge of Matt and his platoon sees a German Panzer tank and tells everybody to charge, and the lieutenant runs out with a revolver in his hand shooting at this tank, and when he turns around to call on his men, no one's there. He's by himself, he's running at this tank, and he's an idiot. And apparently the tank shot him with a tank shell, so he definitely died and got blown up. And this isn't like a traumatizing story for Matt. This is like him having fun, telling John about this asshole that died. And then we cut to John after the visit with Matt, and he's walking at night, and of course it's pouring rain and everything, and he's kind of thinking about what Matt said, and he's really not wanting to go where he's going. and that is to go visit the snob. And of course, the snob isn't like at a house or anything. He's at a fancy club called the Cambridge Club that is only for people who went to Cambridge. So of course, as John walks up to the doorman looks at John and gives him a once over, seeing how kind of ratty his clothes are compared to the people that he normally lets in. And he decides that John is improperly dressed to enter, and he tells John to move along and that there is no business for him here. And then we get this cool scene of John using magic kind of willy-nilly, which he hasn't done too much in the series. And he kind of does like a Jedi mind trick, and he just looks at the doorman and he says, "I'm wearing a dinner jacket, a bow tie, and a top hat, and I have an invitation to dine with Lord Halsham. Isn't that right?" And the doorman looks at him again and says, "Quite right, sir. Please go in." And as John walks in, the narration says, "I'm not really supposed to do things like that, but I'm in no mood to piss about. Screw the rules." So John walks into this fancy club, and pretty much it's just guys in suits hanging around, reading newspapers, talking to each other, nothing special. And he goes up to the second floor, and we see a tall man talking to a short man, and he has identified that that is the snob. The narration says, "And there he is, by the fire like he always is, the biggest bastard of all. He's been coming here since the club began, but he doesn't look his age. I wonder if he's really been to Cambridge." So as John approaches the two men talking, they are wrapping up their conversation, and the shorter, fatter man begins to walk away. He happens to see John, and he says, "Oh shit, what are you doing here, Constantine?" And John looks at him and says, "Hello, Charlie, how are you? Still burning down Pakistani grocers, are you? I thought I'd pop in on our mutual friend." And Charlie says to him, "I wouldn't bother. He wouldn't want to talk to your sort, you know." And then Charlie proceeds to walk past John, kind of trying to ignore him, and John calls after him, "Yeah, but he seemed pretty interested in your sort, didn't he? Hope you told him everything, Charlie. Take care." And then John walks over to the man who was talking to Charlie earlier, who's tall and skinny, and now he's sitting in front of a roaring fireplace. And John says he makes a little mental note of Charlie and what Charlie's doing here for the future, if he has one. So like I said, John is walking straight up to this man sitting down by the fire, and John says, "You want to be careful sitting there, mate. You'll get your wings burnt. You might want to watch who you sit with, too." And also, I should say, John is soaked to the bone because it was pouring rain outside. So he just takes off his jacket, and he's just wearing like jeans and a sweater. So he looks totally out of place here. And he proceeds to hang his wet jacket on the fireplace mantle, probably from things that are very, very expensive, and he should not be doing that. And he says, "You don't mind if I join you, do you? Bloody soaking out there. I'll just grab a chair here. Oi, waiter, get us a pint of heavy and a packet of salt and vinegar, will ya?" And then he pulls a chair that's super fancy from another area of the room and sits like right in front of this man who we can assume is the snob. And John looks at him all happy and says, "So, how's eternal life with you, mate?" And the waiter that he yelled at before comes over and tells him that this establishment does not serve pints and chips with vinegar, so John has to order a gin and tonic instead. And the whole time John is doing this, the snob is just sitting there watching, and he says, "Now that you've displayed your customary contempt for my surroundings, I presume you wish to talk to me. I know what it is that you want, John Constantine. Why do you waste time in idle nonsense when you have precious little life left, Constantine? I confess I shall never understand you people." And John says to him, "I was talking to Ellie this morning. It's funny how her lot have a much better idea of what makes us tick than yours, isn't it? She says hello, by the way." And the snob says, "Perhaps you would do better to seek counsel from them then. They are more your type." And then John gets this very mischievous smile on his face, and he says, "Aha, now we're getting to it. Are you going to help me then?" And the snob says, "Of course not. You are at the very least a cunning man, Constantine. Do not overrate yourself. It would not do for you to start believing your own lies." And John takes offense to this, and he says, "What's that supposed to mean?" And the snob answers, "It means that you would not deserve my help even if I were in a position to give it to you, and I am not." And John snaps back, "What do you mean I don't deserve it? You owe me one. Christ, more than one." And the snob responds, "I do not owe you anything. Debts mean nothing to my kind." And John begins to yell at him at this, saying, "You wanker, you total But his swear words are cut off by the snob saying, "Quiet. Be quiet, Constantine, and be careful. I have not forgotten what you have done in the past, but as I said, debts mean nothing. You do overrate yourself. You should understand, Constantine. You mean nothing. You should leave now, don't you agree? And John says, No, I don't. I think you do owe me. I think you owe me an explanation, pal. I want to know why I'm going through all this shit. And while John is kind of arguing with him, the snob is just not paying attention at all. He's looking at his fingernails, seemingly very bored. So he tells John, You're dying of lung cancer because you've been smoking 30 cigarettes a day since you were 17 years old, and you're going to hell because of the evil you've done. Would you like me to remind you of some of it? And John is kind of taken aback by this bluntness, and he says through gritted teeth, Don't trouble yourself. But the snob continues, It's no trouble. You tried to kill your father, amongst many others. You used your friends like shields, then tossed them aside when they were hacked and shattered wreckage. You dabbled in sorcery and magic when it was forbidden. The 10 Commandments were but a joke to you. You've broken the rules, Constantine. It's as simple as that. And at this, John gets really mad, and he actually gets out of his chair and begins to point and yell at the snob, saying, Rules? Rules? Bugger your rules. Stick 'em up your arse. What about the bloody good I've done then? What about it? And the snob is not fazed by any of this craziness that John's doing. And he just says, There is more evil in your life than good, Constantine. Much more. And John just continues to yell through this. He says, Oh, I see. There's some twat sitting somewhere with a pair of scales, is there? Measuring up good and evil in ounces? That's your problem, mate. The whole bloody lot of you just wander about like a pack of wankers, seeing everything in black and white. You are right that you'll never understand us, okay? And I'll tell you something else. You're the sodding problem, not us. You're the ones that make the freaking rules for us, and you don't even understand us. No wonder we're so screwed up. And this seems to have gotten the snob a little bit angry because he stands up and he is about 2 feet taller than John and much more physically imposing. And he says, I am not taking your stupidity into account, John Constantine. It is all that is saving you. Now leave. For all your bluster and arrogance, you are doomed because hell has laid claim to your soul, and it is to hell that you shall go. And even though the snob is much bigger than John, John doesn't back down. He looks him straight in the eye and says, Yeah, well, maybe I'm not the only one, old son. That was Charlie Patterson I just saw you talking to, wasn't it? Good bloke, isn't he? Think about him. Think about what he was saying. Or did it all go in one ear and out the other? Do you really know who your guest is? Charlie Patterson's currently doing his social climbing in a fascinating group of people called the National Front. I hope your dad doesn't know the sort of people you're out with, Gabriel. I don't think he would approve. And with that line, we find out that, even though we might have had suspicions before, this is in fact an angel, and it is the angel Gabriel. And he is visibly shaken by what John just said to him. Because I'm assuming the National Front is some sort of white nationalist political lobby. And it seems God would not be happy with Gabriel hanging out with white nationalists and possibly furthering their agenda. So because of all this shouting, of course, the waiter comes over and he says that they're being too loud and that John will have to leave. And John has no problem with that. His conversation's done with the snob. And as he gets outside, of course, it's still raining, and the narration says, Rain's still on. Good. I need a bath. So much for the snob, then. Going to have to think of something else. And then we get to 3 hours later where John has been thinking really, really hard in a bar. And of course, he's pissed drunk, and the narration says, 3 hours later, and something else has yet to materialize. It's nearly closing time, too. Bollocks. It gets to me, that dickhead sitting up there in his club, just like all his mates. The bastard. What the hell does he know about me? And then John buys himself another double, and the narration continues. I get the feeling I'm coming at this from the wrong angle somehow. I'm missing something. I know I am. I'm doing something wrong. And as he's taking his last drink, he kind of has a revelation, and the narration says, Wait a sec. Not wrong. Different. I'm running about the place looking for help from other people, but I usually rely on myself, don't I? Right then. Do it yourself. Think it through. The problem is that I'm damned because hell has laid claim to my soul. No, that's not it. Hell hasn't done it. Hell's a place, not a person. It's him. But if I'm dealing with someone, holy shit. Oh, that's sneaky. That is sneaky and crazy and bloody up the wall, but it might actually work. And while this narration is going on, the panels of his face are crazy. I mean, he might actually be saying all this out loud into the bar at the people surrounding him, and they probably think he's insane. But now that he's gone through this thought process, he feels a lot better about everything, and he orders another, and he even says that the bartender should have one on him too. And that is the end of the issue. So obviously John has come up with something that will hopefully save his soul from hell, but we will have to wait to find that out until next time. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestransandcomicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.